Thanks. There was a similar book, although I must confess I didn't read it. Neither I did read your book, but I will read this summer both of them. Similar book, but from different perspective. It was written, probably know, by David Stockman.
By whom?
David Stockman.
Stockman, yeah.
He was a budget manager, budget director during the Reagan administration for first mandate and 3 years, and then he resigned. His book is called The Great Deformation. It's now hit in America, and I think it touches the same topic, maybe from different perspective. He's more on Austrian perspective, but you know how Austrians are critical on this subject of deficit and what they think of it. I don't know whether you read the book, but it would be interesting to hear your opinion, how these ideas from different perspectives now have found the point of similarity. And the second, what I wanted to just to mention, or maybe ask you about Greek default. As I know, as I'm aware, Greek already defaulted twice in the last 2 years. And Greek paid 35% to institutional investors and 28% only to private investors for the debt of 150 billion euros. It's much. It's already semi-default, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Right. Regarding the first point, this is what happens at times of crisis. You make some very strange bedfellows. Or you actually find yourself to be in agreement with people that you never imagined you would be in agreement with. So with many people in the Austrian tradition, for instance, they would agree completely and entirely with my argument that Greece should have defaulted immediately. Right? Similarly, they have interesting stories. I don't know this book, but I have read similar texts, and I find a great deal of commonality with lots of, neoliberal Republicans in the United States who also find commonality with what I am saying. But let me go straight to the second point, because for those of us of a certain Greek disposition, it's something that really hurts. It's something that we really want to talk about. Now, my argument was that Greece should have defaulted before it entered into negotiations, or as a preamble to any negotiations with European Union partners, and especially with the Troika and the IMF. You declare default, and then you invite both representatives of finance, international finance, and your European Union partners, say, okay, now, are there any ideas as to how we can minimize the costs to the international banks and to the local banks from our default? Come to us with our suggestion. We didn't do that. We went cap in hand to Germany and said, give us money so that we don't default. And at first they said no. They waited for months. The problem was getting worse because everybody could see that the default could not be averted. The Greek economy for 4 months died, negative investment, making the debt worse, and the capacity, eroding the capacity of the Greek economy to repay it. And then when they gave us the bailout, it wasn't the bailout. What it was they transferred effectively a large chunk of banking losses from Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, Greek banks, onto the shoulders of the Greek taxpayer and, of course, the European taxpayer, because the shoulders of the European taxpayer was clear it wouldn't be able to bear it. So, yes, there was a default, but it happened a year after the bailout loans were given. Effectively, that transfer of losses from the banking sector to the taxpayer happened first. Greece was indebted to the German taxpayer. And then the default that happened was too little, too late, and it affected effectively only the Greek banking sector, the Greek pension funds, and Greek citizens who would purchase some bonds, for their old age. So when you prevent a default from happening. You delay it. While transferring a large chunk of the debt to the official sector, and the official sector says, but that is not going to be defaulted upon. What you do is you create another period of 1 year of negative investment, because everybody knows that this is not a sustainable situation. So you have another year of negative investment, of collapsing GDP, collapsing economic activity, and then when the default comes, it doesn't help. It's not cathartic, to use another Greek word. Like a default in January 2010 would have been cathartic. If we had, like in Iceland, you have a short, sharp shock. After a while, financial markets start lending you again, because you don't owe anything anymore. So with tabula rasa, we start again. But we managed to default and retain an unsustainable debt. Only this time it was the debt to the ECB that does not accept any haircuts. Think about it. Think of, I mentioned that before, the case of the May bond maturity, the bond that is maturing now in May. The ECB, in its infinite wisdom, at the time of the Greek bailout, decided to step into the bond markets and purchase Greek, Italian, Irish, and Portuguese bonds, and some Spanish bonds, in order to create a little bit of demand that would keep the interest rates that these countries are paying relatively low in order to stop them from collapsing. Of course, Mr. Trichet, the worst central banker to have walked on this planet, announced that the ECB would not be spending more than 200 billion. So this was like inviting bond traders to place bets against the ECB's success with a limited budget. The only way of doing this is to say, we're going to burn you however much money you bet against Greek bonds or Italian bonds, we will burn you. Then they don't dare do it. But if you already say what is your own limit, how much ammunition you're allowed to use, then of course they will have more ammunition than you as a central banker. So, just to give you this example. Right? So, they bought Greek bonds. One of these bonds expires now, matures now. Face value, 6 billion. How much did the ECB purchase these bonds for? 4 billion. Because they purchased them at a serious discount, because bondholders that owned them back then, in 2010, 2011, wanted to get rid of them, so they sold them cheap. So the Greek government now, which is bankrupt, will have to go to the European taxpayers and borrow 6 billion to give to the ECB, right? So the ECB can make a profit of 2 billion from a bankrupt member state of the Eurozone. Now, this would not have happened if we had defaulted in January of 2010. So the default that happened was a non-gift. It was part of the problem, not part of the solution. Because if you delay the default and you end up after the default with debts that everybody knows you can't service, it's a fate worse than death.